Today, I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects of all time, the flaw of averages. I believe this is probably the single most widely misunderstood concept in all of investing. I also believe it's the single most important concept to understand if you want to build a truly bulletproof retirement. The flaw of averages has everything to do with volatility, but the concept of volatility is largely overlooked in investment planning because we've all been trained by the financial industry to ignore it. Think about it. Whenever volatility occurs in the financial markets, or more specifically in your investment portfolio, you're told not to worry about it because the markets always come back, right? And if that doesn't work, then you're told there's nothing you can do about volatility. It's simply unavoidable. In order to grow your money, volatility is inevitable. But the truth is, excessive volatility can be mitigated. Volatility is trained out of your thinking because you're taught to focus instead on the average rate of return. That's precisely what I call the flaw of averages. Think about the last time you allocated your 401k among the various investment options, or the last time you researched investments of any kind, really. What did you do? I bet one of the main things you focus on was the historical rates of return. 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, 10 years, lifetime, etc. How do I know that? Because that's what everyone does. Unfortunately, my experience shows that this is absolutely the wrong approach to building and evaluating your investment portfolio. Because focusing on average rates of return outside of the context of volatility is meaningless. I've found the best way to teach this concept is with a few simple mathematical examples. Now, if you're not a math geek like me, don't worry. This is all very basic stuff. Trust me, it'll all make sense, and each one of these examples builds on the others. Example number 1. Let's assume you and your next door neighbor both have $100,000 invested over the course of 2 years. Your neighbor earns nothing in her first year and nothing in her second year as well, 0. We can calculate her average rate of return by adding each of the annual returns together and then dividing by the total number of years. So in this case, we add 0 plus 0, which equals 0, and we divide by 2, the number of years, and we get the average return equals 0. No surprise here, right? I told you it was simple math. Her average rate of return over the 2-year period is 0%. And as you might expect, she still has her $100,000 after the 2-year period. Now, unlike your neighbor, let's assume you lose 50% of your $100,000 during that first year. You now have $50,000. Then in year 2, let's assume you earn 50%. But remember, in year 2, you only earn 50% on the $50,000 you have remaining, not the full $100,000 you started with. So you're only earning $25,000 in that second year for a total account balance of $75,000. But here's where it gets interesting. When we calculate your average rate of return for the 2-year period, we're in for a surprise. Using the same method as we did before, we add negative 50 and positive 50, which equals 0. Then we divide by the same 2 years, and voila, your average return is also 0%, exactly like your neighbor. But unlike your neighbor, whose investment is still worth $100,000, you now have just $75,000. That's a whopping 25% less than you started with. And in case you're wondering, this isn't because you had a loss in the first year. If you run the numbers backwards, meaning you gain 50% in year 1 and lose 50% in year 2, the outcome is exactly the same. Go ahead and try it. The order just doesn't matter. So here I've shown you 2 very different investments and how, even though they have an equal rate of return over the same period of time, they can have dramatically different results when measured in terms of actual dollars. That's why understanding the concept of volatility is so critical. Let's take a look at another example. In this scenario, let's assume you lose 30% in year one and then gain 40% in year two. This time, your average rate of return is 5%. Pretty good, right? But when you do the math, you'll see that your account is still down 2%. So why does it work this way? It's because losses hurt more than gains help, as you can see on the following chart. On the left, we see various percentages of loss for any given investment. And on the right, we see how much you'd have to gain in order to overcome that loss and get back to where you started. So a loss of 25% requires a 33% gain to get back to even. And a loss of 50% requires a gain of 100% to get back to even, and so on. You see, losses really do hurt more than gains help. And this doesn't even take into account if you have to actually use some of your money while the account is down, say for living expenses. That compounds the problem because now that money is gone forever. So let's consider how this might look over a longer period of time. Here we have 3 different hypothetical examples of investments over a period of 6 years. One of them earns an average of 4%, while the other 2 earn an average of 5%. And as you can see, the 2 that earn 5% produce dramatically different results from one another when compared in terms of actual dollars. So all 5% are not created equal. And even though a 5% average return is a full 25% more than a 4% average return, the 4% average return in this example actually results in more dollars than the 5% with greater volatility. So you could get a whopping 25% higher rate of return than someone else and still have less money in the end. I want to share one last example to drive this point home. In this example, imagine there are 2 accounts. The one on the left is built to mitigate volatility. As a result, in good years, it only earns half of what the more aggressive portfolio does. But in bad years, it only loses half. So over time, it stands to reason that the average rate of return for the first portfolio is half of that of the second portfolio. Yet as you can see, the first portfolio wins in terms of the actual account balance. And if you need to make a withdrawal at any time over the 10-year period, you'd be much safer to do so from the first portfolio. So as you can see, if this is your retirement account we're talking about, volatility is much more important than rate of return. The question isn't so much, what's my rate of return, but rather, how did I achieve that rate of return? Was it a fairly smooth ride, or was it more of a roller coaster? The answer is likely to make or break your retirement. We have a saying, it's not what you get, it's how you get it. But the sad truth is all anyone ever talks about is rate of return, when in fact the much bigger determining factor in your success will be your ability to manage volatility. This is the main focus when I build retirement plans because I want each person to understand precisely the impact that managing volatility will have on their own investment success.